Well, hey everyone, it's Hudson, and welcome to this Z52 setup video. This is the first of two setup videos that accompany a review video and a recommendation for some accessories and talk about image quality and how to use this camera and what I actually think of it, which I think it's about as fine and entry level or budget mirrorless interchangeable lens camera as you can find right now. It's the perfect camera for really getting started in photography or working on a budget and having the ability to gather a plethora of really fine lenses without spending a ton of money. So run over, you can just click right above me to see the review video and talk about some accessories and comparisons of some not so expensive lenses, some prime fast lenses to work in low light or to blur backgrounds, some fun stuff. This setup video, we're gonna run all the way through the menu structure. I'm gonna go pretty fast. I expect, if something gets ahead of you, you can pause, you can come back, look at it again. I know there's a lot of you out there buying this camera where you're just gonna put it in auto mode and shoot it like a point and shoot camera. And this video might be beyond what you want right now if that's your main method of working with this camera. I would expect most people who are watching this video are at least gonna work in the program mode. And I'm going to recommend you work in manual mode for everything you do. If exposure and its different variables, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are newer concepts to you, I have a whole series, a core photography course, which you can click right above me to check out and see some sample videos of, where I go through all those concepts. It's a little bit older, it was shot with DSLRs instead of mirrorless cameras, but all the concepts hold true. So this video is going to be more tailored to somebody who wants to go on a photographic journey with this camera or already knows what they're doing and really wants to take control of it and to squeeze everything out of it and understand what this huge plethora of menu options and this highly sophisticated little APS-C camera can do for you. So, it's going to take a while. There's going to be a longer video. There'll be a shorter one that accompanies it where we'll talk about setting up the user modes for an action-specific set of controls, which will actually change some of the buttons around and give you the ability to flip between different focus modes for different types of subjects that you might be tracking: action, wildlife, sports, and then a landscape mode in the user modes, those U buttons, and another one to just kind of keep your base settings and use to create whatever might work best for you. But for right now, we're just going to run through all the menus. We're going to talk about setting this camera up and what all those menu options are for. And there are things that I'll gloss over, some higher end stuff, some flash photography stuff, things like that. But we'll go through it and it'll be a pretty deep dive. So I'm just going to get started. I'm jumping into the menu and I'm going to scooch kind of over to the side of the frame so that there's room for me to put the menus and everything else up here from the camera. So you can see that there's some blinking here. That's just showing us that there's underexposure. This is my main screen. I have the lens cap on to not be distracting with the view of the studio and lighting and all that kind of stuff. One thing people are always a little confused about is there's this little touch symbol with a hand on the screen, and you can tap that. Oh, I tapped the question mark next to it accidentally, which is telling me that the lighting is poor. But if you tap that, it changes touch modes on the screen. This is touch to autofocus. This is touch to autofocus and shoot. This is turning the touch off so it doesn't do anything on the screen. And then there's the move the focus point. That's what I generally leave it at. Wherever I touch on the screen, I can move the focus point to. Like I just tapped the center and moved my focus point there. So that's something that a lot of people get just a little confused, and that's your touch controls on the screen. It's a tap. All right. When I hit the menu button, it's going to take me into the photo shooting button, the menu. If you go left with the little D-pad on the back, you can scroll down through all the different menus and you can see that we go all the way from the photo shooting menu to the My menu, and we'll run through all these kind of quick. All right. Photo shooting menu, first thing you can do is reset it. I don't want to do that. I've gone through and I've customized it. All right. You can rename your storage folder should you want to. I've named mine for my own purposes, but otherwise, it'll just be some DSC folder. That's just what the memory card is going to put the photos in a folder named. File naming, Nikon standard is sort of DSC. You can change that if you want. You can put your initials or something if you wanted to. Choose image area. I think this is more important on a full frame camera where you can crop down to a DX mode. This you could shoot square, or you could shoot 16:9, but to use the full sensor, you're just going to stick with the DX mode. That's the APS-C, the size of this sensor. Tone mode. This is a new thing Nikon's doing where you can shoot in hyperlog gamut for photography, which is a fancy way of saying sort of logarithmic photography to try to capture more dynamic range in a single frame. I think that the technology is pretty darn young and unproven. I'm going to say stay away from it. All right? Just stick with the SDR, standard dynamic range. Image quality. I like to shoot raw. You know, if you're a JPEG person, I would suggest you at least start shooting RAW plus JPEG and store those RAW files to edit later. RAW files give you all the information that the sensor saw and records all the raw data that it captured about the color and the light coming in, and it lets you adjust the file with way more latitude to fix exposure problems or creatively adjust it down the road. Whereas a JPEG, it takes all that information and it's creates a file based on some preferences that you chose in the picture mode and then crushes it and throws away 90% of the information to make a smaller file, which is not very editable down the road. I remember the point in time in my master photo catalog where I switched from shooting JPEGs to RAW. All the photos before that, I long for the raw data for, now that I love editing my photos and squeezing the maximum quality out of them. So a big pitch for shooting in RAW. Plus, if you adjust your photo editor accordingly, Nikon puts the picture control profile into the RAW file so that if you have the right photo editor, like I use Lightroom Classic, and you tell it to read the profile in the RAW file, it'll come in looking just like the JPEG. You just have a lot more room to change it from that if you want. So I use RAW. All right, image size, that doesn't matter. If you were shooting JPEGs, I would say large. That's going to get you the most pixel density, the most megapixels. You can shoot smaller files if you wanted, if you're just shooting thumbnails for something, for some business project or something. RAW recording, this is about compression. How compressed are the RAW files? And for me, I use lossless compression. You know, if there was no compression, I would choose no compression. I'm a person who's obsessed with image quality and creating prints from my work. And there are times when I take this 20 megapixel sensor and I'll take a shot and I love it and I'll run it through something in Lightroom Classic called super resolution and it'll turn it into an 80 megapixel file. And if it's a nice, sharp, high quality image, it can go from 20 to 80 megapixels and still look great and print much larger. But I don't want any compression. I don't want any image degradation caused by quality. There's lots of people who tell you that high efficiency won't cause any image quality degradation, but I have seen people that have had issues with banding, compressing their images, anything but lossless. So I use lossless. ISO sensitivity settings. You can go in here and you can change your ISO. Now there's a button on the top of the camera near the shutter button that you can hold down, and the front dial turns auto ISO on and off a click at a time, and the back dial adjusts the ISO. That's how I would change ISO. But there's some cool stuff in here. There's auto ISO's maximum sensitivity, which I set at about 10,000 ISO for this camera. I don't really want it going up and capturing images at 51,200 ISO. They're very, very grainy, very, very noisy. 10,000 sort of where I feel I can take it into post-production software and use, I like Lightroom Classic's denoise in their enhance panel, and it will kind of redecant that raw file and clean all the noise out of it. 10,000 ISO is kind of my max on this camera. Now there are other cameras like my Nikon ZF, or if you had a Nikon Z6III with its full frame 24 megapixel sensor, those things are kind of low light champions and they can easily go up to 20 or 26,000 ISO, no problem. All right, so it's just about quality, but that's a place where you can set. I don't want ISO to go any higher than this. Even if it's running an automatic ISO to keep your exposure right. You're controlling shutter speed and aperture, ISO's floating to keep the exposure right, and you just need to keep your eye. That's how I shoot pretty much everything these days. Manual mode where I'm controlling shutter speed and aperture and I'm keeping my eye on the ISO, making sure it's not getting too high. Picture control, this is what we talked about a second ago. I like neutral because that gives me the best representation of the raw data that I'm capturing. You know, you could use vivid and it's going to make everything look more saturated in the preview file that it gives you. It's going to be more of a compressed histogram. For those of you that know how to read the histogram, it's like a bell curve that shows you the brighter parts of the image to the darker parts of the image, and you can really judge whether you've got your exposure right or not looking at that histogram. Something kind of beyond the scope of this video, but it's a very powerful thing, and it's affected by this picture control setting because it reads the embedded JPEG image in the RAW file, and it represents what that embedded JPEG would look like. I tend to shoot in neutral or sometimes monochrome when I want to be looking at the world in black and white and shooting in black and white. If that interests you, flip it to monochrome, run around shooting with that. It's amazing. You get to see the world in pure tone, and it really changes how you think about exposure. So I shoot in neutral and monochrome. Those are the two that I use. You can create your own picture control settings with this manage picture control. You can go in and edit and create and change all the different parameters for creating your own picture control settings. That's pretty high level geekery, and then there's the same thing for hyperlog gamut, which we turned off. That's that high dynamic range. I say leave it alone, stay standard definition. Color space, you can choose Adobe, you can choose sRGB. If you know about color spaces, there can be endless debates. If you ever want to edit a JPEG that you shot with the camera, I like Adobe RGB. It's just a broader color space. This is not all that important. Active delighting is really going to be applied to the RAW file. If you're ever curious about something, you can touch the little question mark up at the top. Improves the level of detail and highlight and shadow areas under high contrast conditions. Well, it really is applied on JPEG, so it's not particularly important for those of us who are RAW shooters. But if you want to turn it on, I would just leave it at low or normal. And you'll see a little bit better shadow and highlight detail retention, and you'll see that in the JPEG representation of your RAW file. Long exposure noise reduction, that's for when you're doing really long exposures, say more than a second, and it will actually take two exposures, one with the shutter closed, one with the shutter open. So it takes your image and then it takes a dark slide with the shutter closed at the same amount of time and the same humidity, same temperature, same climatic conditions, and it looks for any pixels on the sensor that malfunctioned and gives you a little hot pixel, and it eliminates that from the actual file. You know, it's a very, very cool thing when you're doing night photography. High ISO noise reduction, that's only really going to get applied to the JPEG files that you shoot. It's not going to be applied to the RAW files. The long exposure noise reduction, that is applied to RAW files. All right, vignetting control, you know, that just removes vignetting. This is again JPEG stuff, but you know, not a bad thing. It just kind of looks at lens profiles and removes the darkening around the edges of the frame at really wide apertures on certain lenses. Diffraction compensation sharpens up images a little bit for diffraction. When you start working at really narrow ISOs, you can lose some sharpness in different lenses. This is some stuff for portrait photographers: skin softening, portrait impression balance. That's stuff I don't use very much. Photo flicker reduction. If you're working with really flickering lights, you can jump in here into both the photo flicker reduction and the high frequency flicker reduction, which is more LED frequency lighting. And the camera will actually try to take a photo at the most even light so that it's not all flickery and stuttery, but it will adjust the sensitivity of your shutter. You might not get the exact timing you want as you hit the shutter button. I leave that off unless I need it. Metering, you can go through and choose different metering modes. I generally just shoot in matrix metering, and I look at my histogram and I adjust. I find matrix metering is so good. It's an evaluative. You could think of it as AI before we had AI. It has banks of millions of images that it looks at your scene and compares to. You know, back in the early days of photography, snow would confuse the camera's meter. Not anymore. Matrix metering is really quite amazing. Occasionally you want to over or underexpose a little bit. You can say you're shooting a small bird in a really bright sky. You might want to add a stop or stop in a third of exposure compensation just to make sure there's detail in the bird and you don't care if you blow the sky out, that kind of thing. But in general, metering's awfully good. Flash control. There is a little tiny onboard flash in this camera, and you can use through the lens metering, manual control, and you can control compensation for that. What mode of flash? Red eye reduction, rear curtain sync. I generally use either rear curtain sync or fill flash, but you know, if I'm using the little onboard flash, generally fill flash to just add a little lick of light to a dark scene. And I tend to put a stop and 2/3 of compensation on. I find it really puts too bright a flash out, so I back it way off, so it's just a little lick of light to fill some shadows. It works well. Release mode, this is whether it is in high-speed continuous, low-speed continuous, single frame, the fast JPEG modes where it can shoot 30 frames a second and you can do pre-release capture, which is crazy. It means if you're holding the shutter down halfway, it's actually recording images to the card and looping them over the top of each other at 30 frames a second. When you actually push it, it can back up and save the 30 frames before you push the button, which is nuts for capturing things that are unexpected and you're waiting for. Snake's tongue to flick out is an example that I've used, or the batter hitting the ball, you know, those kinds of things. That C30 works great. You can get full resolution JPEGs. It won't work with RAW files though. So, you know, this is your drive mode. Think of it as drive mode. And there's a dedicated button in the top left corner to do that drive mode, which is so sweet with this camera. Focus mode, autofocus continuous, or manual focus, or single servo autofocus. What does all those mean? Continuous means it continues to track your subject and never locks as your subject is moving. Single servo means once you get your perfected focus, say on a still life or a landscape, it's locked. Once it locks in the green, it's locked in, and it's a little bit more accurate, the single servo autofocus, but it won't move with a moving subject. If the camera and your subject are moving distances between each other, you need autofocus continuous. Autofocus continuous is your action movement mode. Single servo is your landscape, still life mode, macro, things that aren't moving. And the auto switch, you know, I'd rather make the choice myself. We're going to put that in the I menu, and we'll talk about the I menu in a minute. That's a quick menu of things that are customizable that you can bring up and adjust anytime without even entering the menu structure. These things will be in the My menu. AF area mode. These are the area. How are you looking for a subject in the frame? And there's a whole bunch of different ones. There's single point autofocus and pinpoint autofocus, which are only available. The pinpoint is only available in the single servo autofocus, not the continuous autofocus. And it's a very fine little focus point for nailing some small little subject out there. Single point is a little bit bigger, but still a small autofocus point, and it's a traditional kind of dumb autofocus point. The whole top of this list does not have subject detection, where the camera is actually looking for subjects and tracking them in the frame. Dynamic area autofocus, that's an old legacy autofocus mode. It will help with continuous autofocus in that it will look to focus points around the selected focus point to keep a subject tracked if it moves slightly off the focus point. And you've got a small, medium, and large of that. It can be handy for things, but think of it as a legacy mode. Then there's a bunch of wide area autofocus modes where it kind of puts a bracket up on the screen, and whether you're looking through the EVF or the back LCD. And if your subject is within that, it will look for what type of subject you're working with. People, animals, vehicles, birds, that kind of thing, airplanes. And you have a small, large, and then customizable sizes, custom 1, custom 2. 3D tracking is a little box that if you put it on your subject, it'll look for eyes, it'll look for vehicles, it'll look for birds and bird's eyes. It will lock them, and once you hold down the autofocus button in AFC, and autofocus continuous, it will track them all over the frame. 3D autofocus is very, very powerful. It only comes with X-Speed 7 cameras like the Z8, the Z9, the Z6III, the ZF, and the Z52. It is what we dreamed of when the Z cameras originally came out, and it's a mode that I live in a lot. Auto area autofocus, the camera makes all the decisions, and it's pretty smart about it. It's something that I frequently use when I'm shooting birds in flight, and they're large enough in the frame. The camera will see it, track it, boom, automatically. I don't even have to put a point on it. And we'll talk about how to set up a button dedicated to auto area autofocus and how to move really quickly between autofocus modes when in the next video that I do, video 2 on the setup, where we talk about setting up user 3 mode for action autofocus. All right, continuing down the photo shooting menu, we've got manual focus subject detection options. This is where the camera is automatically picking up subjects, and you can either turn it off or you can have it on automatic, or you can choose that you're looking for people or animals or birds or vehicles or airplanes. And the camera, in many of its autofocus area modes, wide area, auto area, 3D, it's going to recognize these subjects for what they are and draw a box around it and automatically focus with autofocus lenses. You can also do this with manual focus. That's a new innovation. We'll talk about that in a second. If you use auto, it goes in this specific order: people, animals, birds, vehicles, then airplanes. That's what it's looking for. Generally, I choose the subject I'm working with, but kind of for everyday all and about, the auto detection works pretty well. Manual focus subject detection area. That's what I was just talking about. You can or wide area, large or small, if you're working with a range of subjects and you want to identify which one you want the manual focus subject detection to focus in on and look for a subject. Even though you're using a manual focus lens, it will draw a box around your chosen subject: people, animal, wild, vehicles, just like we had a second ago. And as you focus on them, when they're focused, the box will go green. And if you program, like I recommend doing when we get into the custom settings menu, the OK button to zoom into 100% on your subject, it will zoom without you telling it right on that tracked subject. When it sees a subject's eyes, when you're in people mode, it'll zoom to 100% on the person's eye, lock focus on that, and keep tracking it as you manually focus it precisely. And then if you press a half press of the shutter button, it'll pop back out to a fit view to compose and shoot. It makes manual focus like cheating. All you're seeing is the eye that you want perfect. Get it perfect, shoot. It's pretty amazing. Vibration reduction, whether you want that turned on or off, that's going to be in the eye menu. I'll show you how to put that in the eye menu too. But this camera does not have built-in in-body image stabilization, but lenses like the kit lenses come with built-in vibration reduction. I think that it's okay to just leave it turned on even on the tripod, but with some old lenses, if you were going to use a vintage lens on an f auto bracketing. This is whether or not you want to turn on auto exposure bracketing. For some reason I have it on right now. I'm going to turn it back off. And this is how you would set it up that you want it to be. I like flash and auto exposure bracketing, but auto exposure is what I'm really after. I want 3 frames, 3 stops apart in most situations when I'm shooting in really high contrast. It's a whole nother topic, but it lets you capture 3 frames really quickly of the same scene, expose differentially, blend those, and capture all that dynamic range in post. You can add 6 stops of dynamic range to the sensor's ability to capture highlights and shadows. So it's really great in high contrast scenes, shooting straight into the sun at sunset, that kind of thing, and not having a blown out patch of sky around the sun or black shadows with no details in them. So that's where you go in to change those settings. Again, that will be in the eye menu as well. Multiple exposure, something I don't do a whole ton of, but there's a lot of deep level settings for how you can overlay one frame over another, and blend multiple frames into a single shot, a single digital raw file, which is pretty darn cool. So you can play around with those settings. They're pretty deep. There's lots of tutorials out there. HDR, that's for doing in-camera HDR, high dynamic range shots. Again, I just use auto bracketing to do that. I'd much rather do that myself in post-production and not let the camera's limited choice of options create that file. I'd rather do it in post-production, capture 3 or 5, even 5 frames, 3 stops apart, and blend them in post. Interval timer shooting, this is how I capture time lapse. You can tell the camera I want you to take a picture every so often. You can even tell it as you go in here. There's a lot of cool settings. You can set it to start at a certain amount of time. I'm set for 1 second in between each frame right now. You can tell it I want to capture 240 frames for, that would be 10 seconds of time lapse at 24 frames a second. And I want them to be 1 second apart. And you could, if you're using auto exposure mode, exposure smoothing will make sure there's no giant leaps in exposure. Electronic shutter makes it silent. You can tell it not to focus in between each shot. And then there are options for creating a time-lapse video even. There's all kinds of cool stuff from your intervalometer. So you might as well do it this way. You still get a video out of it, and you have all the raw files to be able to do much higher level time-lapse if you want down the road. You can also do in-camera time-lapse video. That's sort of like the difference between capturing raw files and JPEGs. It's not much you can tweak in the camera's in-camera time-lapse, but it's something fun to play with. You can go in here, change the parameters, and shoot time-lapse right in camera, and it'll do time-lapse for you. Focus shift shooting, this is about capturing a series of images differentially focused to capture all of a sharp scene. Say you're doing close-up work, or you have a landscape that you can't get the close foreground and the distant mountains all in focus. There are different settings in here that focus around the step width which you say, you know, if you're shooting a landscape and you only need a few frames, you can say a wide step width. It moves quite a bit in between each focus. Focuses the camera, shoots, focuses the camera further out, shoots. And you start with it focused on the closest subject in the scene, and it will move its way out toward infinity. If you're doing macro, you can come down towards the narrow focus step width. There's lots more of tutorials out here. There's a lot of cool stuff to jump into. One thing that's handy is having it always set up a new folder so that you know each folder on the card is a different focus stack. Same thing for intervalometer shooting. And that is your photo shooting menu. Video recording menu, really similar to photo shooting menu, but it's all about video. And I'm gonna go really, really fast, all right? You can reset it to factory defaults. Again, not recommended. And I'll show you how to back up all these settings once you've adjusted them. The storage folder, again, you can name a storage folder. Again, you can change your file naming. I like to name them MOV so that I can tell the difference between pictures and videos. The video file type, you know, I like the highest possible quality. You might not want to be editing and adjusting these videos in post-production. I'm using H.265 10-bit, very wide dynamic range files, but you might want 8-bit to make it easier to work with, H.265. And you can read, they've got a little description there. And you can also hit that question mark at any time on the screen and it'll go through a whole list of things to know about. So I'll just leave it at that. This is what I use. Others might want something different. I like 24 frames a second and I'm working at 4K, which is about your max with this camera. And 24 frames a second is nice and filmic looking. 4K is 3840 by 2160. This is 1080p, and you can shoot 1080p at up to 120 frames a second for slow motion if you want with this camera. Again, same kind of ISO sensitivity settings. You know, you can set your maximum ISO. I don't use auto ISO for video. I like things to stay locked in when I'm working in video. Another topic. Active D-lighting, I leave it on normal. It does in the video, and it is baked into video. High ISO noise reduction, I leave it normal, or I turn off sometimes if I want to. Portrait stuff for video portrait, you know, if you were doing fashion portrait shoots or fashion video shoots, I leave the skin softening portrait impression off. Again, the video flicker reduction, that's important because we're often working with incandescent lighting or LED lighting, and I turn it to auto. Sometimes with LED lighting, you'll still see flickering, and that's when I go into high frequency flicker reduction. That's something you'd use if you needed it. Metering, again, the same modes for metering you can choose. Focusing mode. Focusing mode for video has some pretty cool stuff. I generally use manual focus or full-time autofocus. Occasionally, you know, I'll pick continuous and pick points, but the full-time AFF, the camera's constantly focusing, constantly looking for a subject. You can tap a different subject if you're running the camera, but for me right now, I'm filming this with my Z9 with a 35 1.4 lens on it, and it's in AFF with human eye detect, and it's constantly looking for my eye. And when I look up at my little monitor up there, I see an orange box around my eye, and I know that it's focused on me. So it's a really smart autofocus mode. It basically does closest subject priority, and it tracks eyes for whatever type of subject you're working with. Autofocus area mode, you can do the same kinds, you know, there's not 3D, there's subject tracking autofocus where you tap a subject and it'll trap that subject. That's handy if you're running the camera yourself. You just tap the LCD on the subject you want it to track, and then you can tap another subject and it'll transition. Subject detection options, we've got all the different types of subjects that we could choose from: people, animal, birds, vehicles, airplanes. And if you use auto, whether you're in stills or in video, it goes in this order. It looks for people first, then animals, then birds, then vehicles, then airplanes, all right? So I generally shoot people when I'm doing video. Product review mode, this is a new thing with this camera. I haven't even really tested it yet, but what it does is if you put it in product review mode, when you hold a subject out in front of the camera, it won't be jumping up and trying to focus on your eyes. If you're in AFF and you throw a product out in front of it, it knows, oh, this person's showing me something, and it'll stay focused on the thing you're showing them instead of jumping to the eye, which can be annoying when you're doing that kind of thing. Manual focus subject detection area. Ooh, that is a cool thing. So when you're doing manual focus, it will still do subject detection. And that is an amazing feature in the Z52, the Nikon Z6 III, and the Nikon ZF, in that you can still see the eyes of people or the eyes of birds or vehicles pop up with a box drawn around them, either in auto area or one of the wide area modes. And then when you focus, that box will go green when it's perfectly focused with a manual focus setting or a manual focus lens. Or if you hit a program button to zoom to 100%, it will zoom on the tracked subject, and keep it tracked. So photographing people with manual focus lenses is suddenly a piece of cake. And that's available both in stills and video. It's really powerful. All right, video self-timer. Nah, I don't use that very much, but you could set it to take a minute before it starts the video. Vibration reduction, depending on whether you have a lens with vibration reduction built in. Remember, the Z52, to save on cost, does not have in-body image stabilization. Electronic vibration reduction, that crops in on the sensor a little bit and keeps the video stable by sort of moving which pixels are capturing the scene. Kind of crazy stuff, almost like IBIS, but on the sensor. GoPro does that really well. This camera has that ability, but you are cropping in a bit on the sensor. It can be used in a really rough situation. Think you're on the back of a motorcycle trying to track another motorcycle going through rough country. Yeah, you might want to turn that on. Microphone sensitivity. If you're working with external mics, you're going to want to listen and adjust this, but you can also leave it set to auto to just sort of try to keep peaks from being blown out. Attenuator, this is more stuff that you can just add a little bit of control over your microphone sensitivity. Frequency response, are you listening for voices or are you listening for the broad world at large? Wind noise reduction, if you're out in a windy area, it might be able to help a little bit. Whether or not it's providing power to a jacked-in microphone in the microphone port, phantom power. Headphone volume, if you're listening in on how is my audio sounding while I'm recording video, you can adjust the headphones volume. Time code, that's kind of advanced stuff for videographers and filmmakers. The same with external recording control through the HDMI input. And then there's a high-res zoom. Allows you to sort of zoom in on the sensor. With the Z9 and the Z8, because they have 8K sensors, you could, in 4K, zoom into the DX crop really smoothly as if you were zooming a lens, but perfectly with no distortion, and smoothly with 2 power buttons on the camera. This camera, you can zoom. If you're only shooting in 1080p, it won't work in 4K settings because there isn't enough extra pixels to be sort of downsampling it and keeping it at 4K. You can do it in 1080, but not in 4K. All right, so there you go. Let's jump into the custom settings. These are deep. It's going to take us a bit of time, and you can jump into the A settings and back out, jump into the B settings and back out. They have them categorized like this, which is great. When it comes to focus, there's whether or not when you're in AFC in the continuous autofocus, you want to prioritize release or focus. I generally prioritize release. In the AFS, you can prioritize focus. That's that single servo mode where you're trying to get a perfect focus of a non-moving subject. Focus tracking with lock-on. This is one where the standard setting to me, if something looks away, sometimes it'll look for another subject a little faster than I like, so I set it one move off the default. The default is 4, I move it to 4.5, so I move it halfway over towards 5, or maybe I guess I move it to 4 actually, sorry. And default is 3, I move it to 4. It just sticks with the subject a little bit longer if the connection is interrupted while it's tracking a subject. Focus points used, you can use half the focus points if you don't like moving them around the screen so much. I like having all the focus points. Store points by orientation. There's 2 settings under this when you move to the right. You want to store the focus point by orientation. That means that if you're shooting something landscape styled and it's coming into the frame from the right, you can put your focus point over to capture on the right as it comes into the frame. Then when you flip to vertical, you can move your focus point over to sort of the lower part of the frame if the camera were held horizontal, and it will remember where to put that focus point, where it was last when you were vertical, where it was last when you were horizontal, and it'll stick there. What people get into trouble with is they set it to focus point and AF area mode, and if they have a different AF area 3D tracking to wide area tracking based on whether you're holding it up or down, and I get all kinds of questions from people about that. I would say leave it at focus point. Focus point is handy. Focus point plus AF area mode is confusing. AF activation. This is about back button focus. I turn this off. I don't want the focus to be on my shutter. I'm going to show you how to put this in your My menu so that if you hand the camera to someone who doesn't understand that shooting the picture is one thing and focusing is another. I mean, you won't find very many pro photographers and serious photographers who want their focus. You don't want to refocus every time you take a shot. Sometimes you're going to get your subject focused and you just slightly recompose and shoot differently and you don't want to move the focus point and keep it over your subject the whole time. Say you're shooting a still life. You know, it's just really handy to be able to focus with your thumb on the AFL, AEL button in the back and shoot with your finger. And this is the setting, AF on only, boom. That sets it so that it's no longer on the shutter. Focus point persistence. I like automatic on this. This is about hybrid handoff autofocus. It's something we'll talk about when we do the U3 action wildlife autofocus settings, the user modes. It lets you transfer a point captured in one autofocus area mode to another without losing the point. It's very, very cool. We call it hybrid handoff. That phrase was coined, I think, by Tom Hogan, and I think it absolutely describes it perfectly, and I love that method of shooting. So, but we don't need to get into it here. I leave it on auto. Limit AF area mode selection. This will show you what I think is important. I tend to not use dynamic autofocus areas. I use pinpoint, single point. I use wide area. I use 3D tracking and auto area. Those are the ones, you know, if you're running through settings, this will limit it so that you're not going through a huge long list. Focus point wraparound. This is like a keyboard on your television screen or a video game where you can go off the right side and pop up on the left side to get to a character quicker that's on the opposite side. You can move your focus point off the right side of the frame and bring it over to the left. Some people love that. I find it confusing. I much prefer just moving it left and right, and I don't want to jump to the left from the right, left, you know, back and forth. It just doesn't work for me, but many people it does work for. That's a choice you can make there. Focus point display. These are just ways to customize how your focus point looks, when you see it, when you don't see it. And so this is, you can go in here and change the color and the size and whether it displays in manual focus mode. I leave the display of it on everywhere I can, and I tend to like the white setting for color and a border width of 1. But you can change all those settings. Built-in AF Assist Illuminator. This is the one that drives people crazy in night shoots when someone hasn't turned this off. It adds a little bit of light in low-lit autofocus situations like shooting portraits at an event, but it throws this green glowing light out, and it can be really annoying to other photographers. It can be annoying to subjects. I would say turn it off unless you need it. Focus peaking. This is one when you're manually focusing where you see things kind of shimmering that are in focus, and you can adjust what color and what level of peaking, and Nikon does a really nice job of it, and it annoys me to no end when I use it. I have other ways of autofocus or manually focusing, and particularly with this camera with its manual focus subject detection, most of the subjects that I'm going to be shooting that I want to focus can be automatically detected. It draws a box around them. I focus, it turns green. I hit the OK button, which I'm going to program to zoom to 100%. I'll show you in a minute. And it zooms in, tracks the subject's eye, and I can focus it perfectly and fire. Some people love peaking. To me, it just takes me away from the image I'm creating. Everything feels too digital, and I don't like it. But a lot of people love it. This is where you turn it on and adjust it. Focus point speed selection. You can speed up how fast the focus point moves around the frame as you're adjusting it. I like normal, but you can slow it down or speed it up. ISO sensitivity steps, so you can change your ISO by a third of a stop or by a whole stop if you want to move really fast through exposure, but you won't have as much nuance. Same thing with just aperture and shutter speed here. You can go half steps, whole steps, third steps. Easy exposure compensation, that's not having to use the exposure compensation button to do exposure compensation. I would leave that off. Matrix metering face detection. I like the camera to prioritize the faces in my scene over the rest of the scene. You know you want a good exposure on your portrait subjects. If it blows the sky out a little bit, so be it, something to fix in post. So I leave that turned on. Center weighted area, I don't use center weighted metering, but I would use standard if I did. You can make it a smaller weight or a larger weight in the center for choosing how to meter the scene, old school style. Fine tune optimal exposure. If you don't like the way the camera is calculating exposure, you can force it to be a little under or overexposed just by default with this setting. I don't change it myself. I love Nikon's matrix metering. Now we're getting into the C settings. The shutter release button auto exposure lock. I don't want it to lock exposure with a half press of the shutter button. I really think the shutter button is to fire the camera, to take the picture. This says now. Everything else I'd rather control with another means. Self-timer, you can go in and change the settings for the self-timer. This is also available in the timer mode when you're in the drive mode button, but you can tell it how long do I want it to be, from 2 to 20 seconds, how many frames do I want it to capture, you know, for, what's the interval between the shots. So pretty cool stuff. Power off delay. This is for setting up the camera so that you save battery power. Right now I have this plugged into USB-C power delivery. You can run it from a battery bank in your tripod. I list those battery banks in my review video. And you can plug it into the wall and charge it. I'm charging it right now while I'm using it. It's keeping topped off by power. But if you're worried about saving battery, you can come in here and set these settings up to be very short duration. The camera times out. Right now I have it set to be really, really long because I'm doing this video for you and I don't want it to time out every time I'm not hitting a button. Continuous low speed shooting speed. So there's a continuous low and a continuous high. Continuous high for RAW files is 9 frames a second. Continuous low, you can choose your setting. I like about 4 frames a second. Maximum bursts, maximum shots per burst. You hold down the shutter, you know, in continuous high speed capture. 200 is as high as you can go. I set it at the max. Pre-release capture settings. This is where I was talking to you about what happens if you put it in that C30 mode or that C15 mode where it's capturing 30 full resolution JPEGs per second, and it'll back up and capture before you actually depress the shutter all the way. If you're holding it halfway down, it's recording, and then recording over, and then recording over, and then recording over, and when you press it, it saves. How much does it save? Well, you can say in its pre-release burst, I want it to save a half a second or a third a second, none, or a whole second of photos, which would be 30 frames. And then after you're done, you can set how long you want it to keep recording after you pick up the button. Let it record another second afterwards. It's going to take some culling, but you can make sure you get that decisive moment. Synchronized release. This is for working with multiple cameras all synchronized up. We don't need to go into that. Exposure delay mode. I love that this camera has the exposure delay mode. They took it away from Nikon cameras and then they gave it back after all of us complained. What it does is you press the button and it waits however long you tell it, from 3 seconds down to 0.2 of a second before it actually fires. That way you don't need a cable release. You can press the shutter, wait a second, click. It takes the picture without you touching the camera and shaking it when you're doing those sort of shorter duration long exposures. Something, you know, saying you're working with a 50mm lens and it's a 20th of a second or a 15th of a second or a second, and pushing the button would actually shake the camera and cause the picture to be blurry. With this, you can say, I want you to wait 2 seconds after I push the button. You push the button and take your hand away, and it fires the frame that much later. It's great. It makes it so you really don't need a cable release. And think about it, if you're doing 30 seconds or really long exposures with neutral density, you don't need to worry about it at all because pressing the shutter is such a small portion of that time. You know, it's a fraction of a second out of 30 seconds. You're never gonna notice the shake. Shutter type, you can do electronic shutter, you can do mechanical shutter, you can do auto. I generally leave it at auto. The camera will make the best decision about trying to maximize image quality with what type of shutter. Is it just reading the sensor or is it actually opening and closing the physical shutter? Extended shutter speeds. This is off by default. This is a big one you want to turn on. This gives you shutter speeds below 30 seconds, all the way down to 900 seconds by turning the shutter speed dial. So if you're working with neutral density and you want a really long exposure, you can go all the way to 15 minutes of the camera capturing a scene. Very, very cool. Limit selectable image area, I just leave all these turned on. But if there was some mode you didn't want to be able to select, I don't know. I haven't seen a real need for this, but some people might use it. File number sequence. You can reset it, you can turn it, it's just gonna name the files with numbers. And in fact, anytime you're a little curious about something, hit that question mark and it's just telling you, it tells you exactly what each of these settings does with assigning file numbers to photos. Live view photo mode. People get way off with this sometimes. If this is turned to adjust for ease of viewing, which seems like a good idea, right? Even if your image is set to be very underexposed, you've got it 3 stops underexposed, it's gonna keep a nice bright view in the electronic viewfinder and on the LCD so you can see your framing and whether or not you're in focus. That's what adjust for ease of viewing does, is it just bumps up the ISO to give you a nice clean view in these digital viewfinder and monitor. Show the effects of settings, on the other hand, will show you that you're actually underexposing the image as you're looking through the viewfinder. This is where I generally leave it. You can say, you know, only when a flash is not used. That's a good idea. Because if you want it to see what the effect of your flash is going to be, that can be handy. Actually, I'm going to say always. Yeah, always. And then I like kind of adjusting my flash to taste without thinking about the background. Starlight view. This is for night shooting. We're going to put this in the My menu. When you turn this on, all of a sudden everything is amplified. And if you move the camera on the tripod, it's like tracers, everything goes, there's, you know, lights are blurred across the screen, but it amplifies the light, keeps it really clean. And believe it or not, with a fast enough lens, if you're working with a 1.8 lens, for example, I work with a 21.8 on my Nikon Z6 or my Nikon ZF or the Z9. You can see the Milky Way and you can see the horizon and you can compose with this starlight view on. It's crazy how it amplifies the light signal and lets you see in the dark. You know, it's not something to handhold because everything's shaky at night, but on the tripod, this is an incredible tool. Warm display colors turns everything red, all right? So if I go in and I turn warm display colors to mode 1, you see everything just went red. This is great at night. Doesn't blow your night vision working with the camera. And mode 1 lets you, I think it's mode 1, one of the two modes, I think it's mode 1, gives you just the menus and display and shooting and everything is red, but when you hit play, the images are in full color. Mode 2, everything is red. Even the images that you captured, you only see in red scale. Off, we get back to looking at it. And you can adjust the brightness for different situations you're shooting in. View all in continuous mode. You know, are you only going to see that first frame or are you going to keep seeing the sequence as you shoot? I leave that turned on. Release timing indicator. How is it showing you that images are being captured? I like lines to appear at the left and right edges of the frame as the picture is being taken in the LCD, just like little flashing lines to show that that's what's happening. This camera, it's not as important as some of the other cameras. They left this setting in here from the Z8 and the Z9, which don't have a shutter at all, and you have 2 different feeds. One goes to the viewfinder and one goes to from the sensor to the memory card. And so you really don't see any change at all as you're shooting. Those little flickers tell you what's happening. This camera, you can feel a little but it's not as much interruption as I was used to in the DSLR days. It's very, very easy to shoot continuous with this in comparison to the original generation of Z cameras. Image frame, you know, are we seeing the image frame or not, a frame around our image while we're shooting? These are display things while we're out there framing up and shooting. What kind of grid type would you like? I like a 3x3 rule of thirds grid. You can go in and choose different grid proportions. Virtual horizon type. I like the fancy new type A that looks like a kind of a airplane pilot's level. Type B is the old school, like we had the DSLRs. I like the type A. Half press to cancel zoom for manual focus. So this is really nice. Like I told you, you can program a custom button to automatically zoom to 100% on your tracked subject when you're manually focusing. With this setting, this is a new setting, I love it. on D18, if you half press the shutter button, it takes you out of the full zoom. So you get the perfect focus, you half press the shutter button, you can recompose and shoot. Because I used to just shoot, and you blow one frame because your composition was off, you were perfecting focus, and then you recompose and shoot as you move. This way you can half press that to come out of the 100%, zoom in during manual focusing perfection, and then fire the frame with your composition adjusted. Custom monitor shooting display. Okay, this could take us a little time. You can go in, and each one of these displays is customizable, and you can turn each one on and off with pressing the OK button while you're hovering over it. And I'll just show you how I have mine set up. Display 1, all I have is the touch screen controls, the level, the histogram to see my exposure, and the grid. That's it. All right. Display 2 adds simple exposure information. Otherwise, it's the same. Display 3 adds simple and detailed exposure information. I never put the center point or the center weighted area into. It's just clutter I'm not using. And then display 5 is just the information display. I like that. Sometimes I just want to be looking at that big thing when I'm on the tripod of what are my exposure settings and important iMenu settings. All right. So then custom viewfinder, the same thing, but when you're looking through the EVF. And the display 1 is really similar. I just have the grid and the level and the histogram. Display 2 adds the simple exposure information. Display 3 adds the detailed exposure information. Display 4 is a clean nothing view. Absolutely nothing but the focus box. And that's really nice looking through the viewfinder sometimes. And what that is when you press the display button, it will cycle through those. It will cycle through those different settings. So you can have less or you can have more. You can customize them how you want. It's pretty cool. Flash sync speed, I have it set at the maximum, 1/200. Flash shutter speed, you can change what shutter speed you want the flash to go at. Exposure compensation for flash, you can choose whether it's the entire frame or the background only. Auto ISO sensitivity control for flash, subject and background or subject only. This is all more complicated flash stuff. We're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on it. Auto bracketing, do you want to do flash and then shutter speed, flash, shutter speed and aperture, flash and ISO, flash only. I like flash and shutter speed. When I'm doing exposure bracketing, usually I'm not using a flash. I'm out in the landscape and I'm capturing high dynamic range scenes with differential exposure, 3 stops underexposed on the light meter, 3 stops overexposed. And I really want to use shutter speed to do that, not changing aperture so that the scene looks different from frame to frame. So I just put flash and speed. That way it uses shutter speed to do bracketing. Bracketing order normal. People get confused here. When you're exposure bracketing, so you're going to shoot underexposed, on the meter, overexposed, it seems like it would make sense to shoot the underexposed frame first, then the one on the meter, then the one over. But the way Nikon designs this is one of my small complaints. To do that, you would have to set up the camera to be 3 frames or 3 stops underexposed for the first frame, and then it would go up from there. By leaving it on the meter, the first shot is on the meter shot, then it automatically adjusts under and overexposed. You get into trouble changing it. Just go with normal. Just trust me, go with normal. Flash burst priority, prioritize precise flash control or prioritize shooting in high-speed continuous mode. I just prioritize precise flash. I'm not using flash a ton with this camera anyway. Customizing your eye menu. So this is the menu when you're out here shooting and you hit the I button up above the D-pad. You can come up with these quick change settings and you can tap, all right, to get into this. Like AF area mode, you can choose what subject you're going to change to, whether auto area, autofocus, 3D autofocus, go into one of the wide areas. You can do that all on the touch screen or with the D-pad on the back. And you can say, I want people, I want animals, I want auto. All right, just that easy by touching the screen. Touch OK. That's all accessible here. What about monitor brightness? Right now I'm using the monitor. If I were in the viewfinder, looking through the viewfinder, it would be viewfinder brightness. Those controls are right there. White balance, I could change my white balance. All those controls are quick and easy just by pressing the I button. Well, we can customize that right here, all right? If we go into our menu, we're going to go back into here under controls, and we go into the customize I menu. We can go in here and choose from a selection. So I'm going to show you what I have. This is my sort of tried and true settings. If you download my settings, which I'm making available, you can click the link in this video or in my review video and go to my website, download these settings and upload them to your Z52 if you want to try them out. this is what you'll have for an iMenu. And this is what I do. I do white balance, and you can select that by, you can tap it, or you can hit the OK button on the D-pad, and you can run through this huge list, right? You can choose something other than white balance, and then it would be there. Monitor brightness, monitor viewfinder brightness, metering if I wanted to change metering, vibration reduction if I wanted to turn it off on the tripod with an old vibration reduction lens, bracketing if I want to turn on auto exposure bracketing like we were talking about, where we capture one frame on the meter, 3 stops underexposed, 3 stops overexposed automatically, to be able to blend those and capture more dynamic range scene wide and high contrast situations. Long exposure noise reduction, turning that on and off if we're working doing long exposures. There's times where you don't want it, most times you do. Interval timer shooting, this is what we use to capture time lapse. Other things where you just want to capture an image every so often and let the camera do it all by itself. You've got it set up, you let it run. Focus shift shooting. Focus shift shooting is a cool mode you can go into where you can actually have the camera make little adjustments in focus and capture the entire depth of field of a scene in multiple frames to blend in focus stacking software. Silent mode goes completely dead quiet. Say you're doing surreptitious street shooting, or you're working at a wedding and you don't want to make any noise. It does electronic shutter, turns off any camera noises that are turned on. Exposure delay mode, we talked about this. This is for using instead of a cable release. You push the shutter, take your hand away, and you can jump in and change those settings. Whether or not you're in AFC, AFS, or AF, or manual focus and stills, and it adds in autofocus full-time in video. So those settings are right there. And then what your AF area mode and subject detection mode are, that's what I like to have in my iMenu. All right. Custom controls for shooting. So this is when you're out shooting, you can customize all the different buttons. I'm not changing a whole lot except the function buttons. All right. I changed the function buttons to cycle the AF area mode. All right. And what happens, you can do the same thing here. You can click, you push OK, and then you can go to the right, and I can say, I want to be able to cycle between my most used modes, just in general use, all right? And that's single point autofocus for me, wide area autofocus large, 3D tracking, and auto area. Those are the ones I use all the time. And so when I'm out shooting, I've set that up so that that function 1 button, you can see it highlighted in orange or in yellow on the camera here. When I'm out shooting and I tap that button, now I'm in auto area. Now I'm in single point. Now I'm in wide area. Now I'm back in 3D, all right? You can see it up at the top changing. Boom, 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 all right? That's just by clicking that button. That takes me, I don't have to go into any menu at all to switch autofocus area modes. Very, very handy, all right? So going back into our menu again, the function 2 button, this is bracketing burst. What is bracketing burst? Well, let's say I'm out handheld, walking around in the landscape, and I decide I want to bracket a scene. And I'm hand holding, I'm not on the tripod, but I want to capture really high dynamic range scene. And I go into my iMenu here, and I choose bracketing, and I turn bracketing on, and now I'm shooting 3 frames, 3 stops apart. You can see a representation of that. When I hold down the bracketing burst button and press the shutter, it'll fire all 3 frames. It fires them as a burst. I wish it just automatically did that. If there was a setting for that in bracketing. Leica has that, but Nikon hasn't done that. But we do get a button to be able to activate it, and I use bracketing so much, I burn my function 2 button where I just press that with my ring finger, and pressing the shutter button will automatically bracket for me, all right? So coming back into controls, I changed my movie record button, that's that button up near the shutter on the left, to be exposure preview. So this camera only previews narrow aperture exposures, the effects of aperture on depth of field up to f5.6. That's been the case for every Nikon Z camera since the inception of the Nikon Z cameras. And you have to press that movie record, or a button assigned to preview to see narrower aperture. So if I stop down to f11 and I want to see if the whole scene is sharp, I need to press that movie record button to preview the frame. You know, this is only for stills shooting. I don't shoot videos in still mode, so that video record button is a free button, and I assign it to preview. And that's basically the only things I change from stock in my standard setting. We're gonna change a lot of stuff when we go into the second video in this series where we adjust those user modes to set up an action autofocus mode. We're going to change a number of buttons around to do some really high-end focusing stuff that's fun. You know, I jumped out of custom controls a little too quickly, so I'm going to jump back in and say one more really important one that I do program to be different, and that is I like my OK button to be zoom, and I want it to zoom to 100%, 1-to-1 on the OK button. That's really, really important to me. So that helps with that manual focus subject detection mode. Or just when I'm out shooting and I want to zoom in to check whether or not something's sharp and in focus, it zooms to 100%, either on the focus point or on the subject if subject detection modes are working in auto area autofocus or wide area or 3D autofocus. So that's the one other control button that I remap by default. All right, so then custom controls playback. I don't really adjust these at all. You can go in and change what every button does while you're playing back images, but I find this camera does everything I need in playback mode, and I don't really need to do that, but you could. The touch function, I like leaving it turned on. You can assign the touch function to move the focus. This is that thing, to move the focus point around, set absolute focus position. Oh, this is double tapping. Oh, yeah. This is really cool. Okay, sorry. So the touch function, if you double tap the screen while you're shooting, even if the screen is turned off and you're looking through the viewfinder, if you double tap the screen, the blank screen that's underneath your cheek, if you double tap it with your thumb, it'll center the focus point. Super, super cool. Or you can have it set an absolute focus position. I like having it center the focus point. You can have it do these other things if you wanted to, but I like it to center the focus point. So, all right. Then control lock. You could lock all your controls if you wanted to, variably. If you just don't want any settings being changed, you've got it set up in a fixed position, you're doing some project. There's people who sometimes just want to lock all the controls so they can't be changed. You can reverse the dial rotations. If you're used to another brand that's opposite, you can go in and customize those to be reversed. You can set it so that you push a button like exposure compensation and let go of it and then adjust the wheels and then push it again to relock it. I don't like that. A lot of people do. It's not, I'd rather hold the button down and roll the wheel at the same time. That way I don't accidentally leave it on. You can reverse the meter display, positive and minus, if you're used to another brand that did them differently with positive exposure compensation to the left and negative to the right. I've always been used to negative to the left, positive to the right. You can reverse the ring for focus if you're used to another brand where the focus was different. I've never needed to do that. If you have a camera with a focus ring, you can adjust its range of motion. How fine is that focus? How far do you have to turn it to change from infinity to close? Your control ring response. If there's a control ring you have set to say change aperture on your lens, you can change it to be really sensitive or not so sensitive. You can switch the focus and control ring roles. You know, this camera doesn't have a focus. This particular lens I have on here doesn't have a focus ring. It has a zoom ring and a control ring. So, you know, that's not active right now. Sometimes you'll find things grayed out when they can't be used under the current settings or with the current lens. Power zoom button options. You can reprogram lenses that have power zooms. I don't work with power zooms a lot, but you could do that. Full frame playback flicks. When you're looking at images on the screen, what do flicks do? You can change it so that they change the rating, or they select them, or they protect them, or it adds a voice menu, both for flicking up and for flicking down. Flicking left and right, I do tend to do. You can say which direction it is. Is it sort of phone style, or is it more computer style? You can change the direction. I like it to go the same direction I'm moving my hand. But you can change that if it doesn't seem natural to you. And then these are videos functions. So in video functions, you can do all the same things with adjusting the eye menu. I don't change much in here, to be completely honest with you. I tweak it a little bit just so that it's the same as my camera controls. I have picture control, electronic vibration reduction, standard vibration reduction for lenses with it, white balance, the image quality, that's that, you know, am I shooting at 4K, 24 frames per second? Customize controls because you might want to change things up shooting video. Wind noise reduction, microphone sensitivity, that product review mode, turning it on and off, airplane mode, and then your focus mode and your area and subject detection. It's pretty similar. Customizing controls, you can go in and customize the controls for video. I haven't really done that. We won't go too deep into any of that. Control lock, again, you can lock all your controls for video. Limit your autofocus area mode selections for videos, the same sort of thing. How fast is autofocus speed? This is important for people doing filmic work where they want the focus to shift from one subject to another really slowly. Say you're in that mode where you tap which subject you want to stay autofocused on and from person to person. You want it to be a nice slow filmic shift, or do you want it to snap? This is where you control that. Tracking sensitivity, same thing we had before. You know, I generally, like I said, leave it around 5, a little bit slower to leave a subject if they turn their head away, for example. Your high-res zoom speed, that's that zoom where it actually uses the sensor's resolution and takes the image from downsampling a 4K image down to a 1080p image. It only works in 1080p with this camera, like I said. But you can change the speed with which that emulated zoom using the sensor's resolution changes. Power zoom button options for video, same thing. A little more useful with video than stills. You can do fine ISO control, whether you want to be in just super, super fine in between ISO speeds. Extended shutter speeds for video. I don't see a whole lot of need for that. View assist, that's whether or not you see, say, zebra patterns for when when you've blown out exposure in a video, you'll see sort of little sparkles happening like a zebra striped pattern in the blown out area, and you can adjust what the zebra stripe pattern looks like and at what threshold it hits. A lot of more advanced video type stuff. You can limit the tonal range of the zebra patterns. Same thing with the grid. I like that rule of thirds grid. Brightness and information display. You can choose whether or not you want a waveform like videographers tend to use, whether you want it big over the middle of the frame, whether you want it small, whether you want to see a histogram. I often use waveforms, but you know, that's just because I'm used to video. Half press to cancel zoom. For the manual focus subject detection, again, I'm going to leave that turned on. I love that. Custom monitor shooting display. That's, again, all those same customizations that you can do. I haven't adjusted these for video, but it's the same thing as stills, where you can customize the different screens that you flip through by pressing the display button that you cycle through when you're shooting video. And whether or not there's a red frame indicator around the frame when you're recording shooting video. That's really handy. There's also a light up front that goes red for if you're in front of the camera recording without someone running it behind the scenes, where you can see that it is indeed recording. And that, believe it or not, is the end of our custom settings menu. So we're going to jump in and we'll go pretty fast through the rest. All right, we got playback menu. In the playback menu, you can choose what folder you're playing back. If there's multiple folders on the memory card, you can go in and look at individual playback display options. I like to, actually I think I'm going to adjust this as, I like the RGB histogram, and I like none, just the picture only. And I think I like basic shooting data. So that shows me the shutter speed, aperture, ISO, that kind of stuff. Those are the only 3 views that I really want. I want to see the histogram of all 3 colors, red, green, and blue, along with a composite histogram to see my exposure. And I want to see the picture clean with no other information on it. And I want basic shooting data. That's all I need. All right, series playback. Series playback, you know, it can automatically just show you all the pictures in a series when you did high-speed continuous burst and you're holding the shutter speed down, or you're shooting that C30 mode. And you can change the way that it plays those back. You can set it so that you only see a single thumbnail for a burst. I don't tend to turn that stuff on. I go through each image in the series old-fashioned style. But it's possible for you. If you shoot a lot of bursts, you can make it so that it only shows you the first or the last image in the burst, and then you can play them. You can have it automatically play them or not, and you can adjust how it plays those back. Picture review. This is when you press the shutter and take a picture, then does it display the picture automatically in the EVF or the LCD for a second after you shot it? I find that hyper annoying. I want to hit the button to view the image that I shot. I don't want it to do it automatically for me, but some people like it, so this is where you would turn that on and off. After delete, this is one that I would suggest you change from stock. It always says show next, which is like if you deleted a file, say you were starting with the last file, you're going backwards through your frames. If you have this say show next and you delete a file, it goes to the one that you've already viewed that was after it, the later photo. If you say continue as before, if you're moving to the left and you delete a file, it'll go to the next one to the left instead of going back to the one you just looked at that's after it. So there you go. I like continue as before. Whichever way I'm moving through images, left or right in my review, if I see an obvious delete, like I took a picture of the ground, I don't want to go back and see the image I just looked at before. I go continue as I'm going. After a burst, which image do you show? The last picture in the burst is my method. You can choose to show the first if you want. Record the camera orientation, yes. I wanted to know whether it was vertical or horizontal. Auto rotate pictures, I leave that turned off, and there's a reason for it. If it auto rotates and you're viewing the image, it's going to show you portrait oriented images tall and narrow in the viewfinder, tiny or in the LCD. And I just want to be able to rotate the camera and look at it big, right? Landscape, I'll just be looking at it that way. I get to a portrait when I can look at it that way if I need to see it right side up. And I get a bigger view of it. I don't want some little compressed thing that's letterboxed with black on both sides. All right. Let's go into our setup menu for a second. Setup lets you format your memory card, make sure you got all your images off it beforehand. It lets you save user settings to that U1, U2, U3 mode to set up different automatic settings for different types of scenes. We'll talk in video 2 about how to set up user modes for action, sports, wildlife, as well as landscape. You can reset the user settings so that you blow them out, there's nothing there anymore. You can change language. We're in English right now. You can change your time and date. You can adjust your monitor's brightness. You can adjust your monitor's color balance. You can adjust your viewfinder's brightness or its color balance. You can look at the viewfinder display size and make it smaller than normal. I like standard. I like to see all of it. But people with glasses might need to make it smaller for some reason if you can't get the diopter adjusted right for your glasses. There's limit monitor mode selection. I don't tend to turn that on. Auto rotate information display. That actually, when you hold the vertical, it'll move all the information, so it'll switch it so that you're able to read it right side up. It's pretty crazy. So even through the viewfinder, suddenly you'll see exposure data and everything flip to be oriented so that you can read it without translating it from sideways in your brain. I like that. Recording lamp brightness, you know, how bright is that video recording light, and I tend to put it at 1. Time-lapse video recording, I don't use the internal time-lapse recording, I use an intervalometer and take individual frames, so I don't even adjust that. You can fine-tune autofocus, which is way less important with the Z cameras because they're autofocusing on the sensor. I've yet to find a Nikon Z designed lens that needs any autofocus tuning. You can tell it lenses that you're using with it, the focal length and maximum aperture, and you can have a whole range of them. You can go in and enter data like I tend to use a 10 millimeter f2 lens, so 10 millimeters and maximum aperture is f2, and that can be my lens number 1. I could name it if I wanted to TT Artisan 10 millimeter f2 DX lens, cheap, kind of amazing little architectural style lens, manual focus. But when I'm going to use that lens, I just choose lens number 1, and it'll know what lens is on it. It'll meter better for it. It knows what aperture the maximum aperture is. Distance units can be feet or meters. Save focus position. This is an interesting one. You'd think you want that turned on by default. You turn off the camera, you turn it back on, it snaps right back to where it was last focused. But the interesting thing about Nikon Z lenses, and even third-party Z autofocus lenses, is that by default, when you turn the camera on, it snaps to infinity focus, and it's very, very accurate. So these days, shooting night scenes with stars, I don't autofocus at all. I just make sure this setting is turned off. I turn off the camera, turn it back on, and it's snapped to infinity, and I know it's focused to infinity. I'll still zoom in and check just because I don't want to waste a night shooting stars, but it's always right. It's kind of amazing. Save zoom position for power zoom lenses. I don't use any power zoom lenses, but if you do, you could choose your setting there. You can do, if you've got dust on your sensor, I suggest you just blow it off with a rocket blower. But you can also create a reference photo to eliminate dust automatically. You can map dead pixels if you're starting to have dead pixels when the camera starts getting old, to eliminate them. I haven't had any dead pixels yet. You can add image comments. You can add your own copyright information. I haven't done that because I'm still saving this user settings file so that you guys can apply it to your own camera and upload it. And I don't want my copyright information in, but you can go in and say your name and what your copyright status on all your files is, and I suggest that you do that. Metadata, whether you want to edit what type of metadata is saved. What is the connector function for the headphone jack? Is it for headphones, or is it for also the wired remote control that they make for this camera, which I suggest you get. It's a great little remote control. I leave it on auto switch, why not? You can choose some functions for how you do voice memos. I don't usually record voice memos on images, but you can. You can customize the sounds this camera makes. I leave it off, personally. Silent mode, you can turn that on and off. Touch controls, whether you want touch controls on or off. Self-portrait mode, I like the self-portrait mode off. It sort of locks a bunch of controls when you're in self-portrait mode. HDMI, are you outputting the shooting information? Like right now I have yes, so that you guys can be seeing through my HDMI cable, and I'm recording out through a switcher to my computer all the information on the screen. If you were shooting video out through HDMI or doing a Zoom meeting, you would want to turn that off. So that it would be a clean information. You just see a clean view. You can choose whether the camera is mirroring or not, you know, to let writing look correct left to right or not. USB connection priority. Are you uploading or are you shooting tethered? Then conformity marking is just a bunch of information about the camera. USB power delivery, I leave that turned on. I never use external battery chargers. I don't even use very many extra batteries. I just, in between shoots, plug a USB power delivery brick into the camera, a little $30 brick, and it tops off while I'm having lunch. At night, I plug the camera into the wall, tops the battery off. I rarely switch batteries these days with USB power delivery. This has to be power delivery capable, PD capable. Energy saving, if you're trying to save batteries, you can flip this on. Lock the camera so that it can't shoot while the slot's empty. I like to have the release locked. I don't know why that's not set, but I'm locking it so I can't run around thinking I'm taking pictures while there's no memory card in the camera. Save and load menu settings. This is an important one. You go in here and you save save menu settings. It will save every menu setting in this camera, including all your user modes, to the memory card in a little bin file, which you can then, along with downloading your images, save somewhere on your computer and back up, all right? And when you format your memory card, those will be gone. So my suggestion is you load the settings off your card. You create your own saved point, not factory default settings, you know, the Hudson default settings. How do I like my camera set up when I pick it up out of the box at the beginning of the day? I'm gonna change settings through the course of the day. They're gonna get all kinds of messed up and changed based on the condition I'm shooting. But the minute I go in here and hit load menu settings, if I did that right now, it would change my power off timer settings so that this camera would be timing out all the time to save battery instead of staying up for you guys to see the menu when I'm not touching it. And so it would go back to my default settings. I would load those menu settings, then get my images off the card, format the card, put the card back in, format it, and then save the menu settings back on. It's really important in that order though. Load your menu settings, unload all the images off the card at the end of the day, put the card back in, format it, then save those menu settings again onto the card. I wish Nikon saved them to internal memory. That would just save so much hassle. If they could save to internal memory and then export to the card to back up on your computer, that would be awesome. But they haven't done that. Leica does do that, Nikon does not. I think Sony does that too, Nikon does not. So, all right, I don't want to save menu settings right now because it would change my power off settings. All right, reset all settings, that's go back to factory default. I don't want to do that. Firmware, this is where you could go in and manually update firmware. You could load them to your memory card. You can also do that through the SnapBridge app pretty darn easily. And speaking of the SnapBridge app and communications, that's where this networking menu comes in. You can flip it to airplane mode so it's not communicating with your phone at all, saving battery. Nikon Imaging Cloud, that's for uploading things to the cloud. I don't tend to do that. Connect to smart device, that's where you would go in and connect to the SnapBridge app on your phone, which is really, really good. You can download full RAW files to edit on your phone. You can download JPEGs from even your RAW files, smaller files, preview files to just be able to share really quickly on social media. You can control the camera remotely from your phone over Bluetooth. There's lots and lots of cool stuff. And you can also update your firmware via the app. It's cool. Your wireless remote control options, you can go in and assign different function buttons and things. Bluetooth remote control options, you can go in and set up Bluetooth remote controllers. You can connect to a computer, an FTP server, or other cameras, or Atomus Air digital recorders. You can connect via USB, you can connect to routers, you can, all kinds of stuff, all right? All kinds of stuff that we're probably not going to use. And then the final thing, which is actually really important, is the My Menu. Again, I can just go to the left and I can scroll up through the menus. The My Menu is a customizable menu, a really important customizable menu where you can add things from the menus you want frequent access to. It's a limited list. I'm going to show you what's in mine. I'm going to show you how you add, get rid of, and move things around, all right? When you first open the My Menu, you aren't going to see all these settings. They're not there. You have to put these settings in yourself. What you're going to see is add items, remove items, rank items, okay? And you can go into add items and it gives you all of the menus, just like the ones to the left. And you could say, I want something from the custom settings menu. I want it from the shooting and display functions. I want to add custom low mode shooting speed. And then you can move up and down with that little yellow line and say, I would like it to be here under warm display colors. Done. All right. Now, if I go up and I look under warm display colors, there it is, CL shooting mode. If I want to get rid of it, same thing. I can remove it. If I want to change where it's positioned, I can go up to it. All right. Right there, click it and move it down. All right. To custom controls, to the very bottom, right, almost. If I want to remove it, that's easy too, all right? I can go to, oh, we're in rank items. I got to go back out. I'm going to go to the left, and I could say remove items, all right? And I can put a checkbox next to that guy. CL continuous, I just push the OK button, it puts a checkbox, and then I can hit the trash can button on the camera or touch the screen where it shows the little trash can delete and say yes. Now that's gone from the My Menu. So that's how you add things, move things, remove things from My Menu, okay? So I'm going to show you what I have in mind. I put airplane mode at the top. It's more for if you have a button set to go to the top of My Menu. If the My Menu item there has a submenu, it'll automatically take you into the submenu, which is annoying. So I just put airplane mode there. Sometimes I want to just make that easy. I put save and load menu settings. Why is that? Because it's so important. Like I said, before I format my memory card, I want to load my menu settings off that memory card, format my memory card, save my menu settings back on. So I put those two things at the very top so I don't forget. AF activation, I told you that if you hand the camera to someone who's used to the focus being on the shutter button, they don't know about using their thumb to focus and their finger to shoot, you can just really easily turn that back on before you hand it to them. Boom, it's right there in the My Menu whenever you want it. Manual focus subject detection area. So sometimes when I'm shooting with the manual focus lens and I want to use wide area or small area or auto area subject detection. You know, if there's a whole bunch of people, I like to have wide area subject detection. If there's just one person moving around in the scene, I don't want to have to move the wide area box around to catch their eyes. They're going to come up in the auto area subject detection. So simple as that. Focus peaking, I can turn it on, I can turn it off. Save user settings, that's for customizing the user controls. I'll talk about why that's important to have access to in video too when we do set up the action and the landscape U3 and U2 modes. Starlight, that's for when you're out shooting stars and you want to amplify the light signal and get that crazy tripod kind of tracer mode where you can see the Milky Way with no moon. Warm display colors, same thing for going red at night, not blowing your night vision. Pre-release capture options, you can adjust that. How long is it recording before I hit the shutter? How long is it recording after I hit the shutter in C15 or C30 mode? Custom controls for shooting. You can jump in and change some of your custom settings really easily if you want to put something different on a button for a particular situation. Custom controls for vehicle, you know, near wildlife, near a kill, and you get focused perfectly, you turn the camera off to save battery, and you're waiting for something to happen. Well, when you turn it back on, you want it to still be focused on the kill. So that's handy, but when you're shooting at night and you want to snap focus to infinity, you turn it off to make sure that it snaps to infinity. That live view mode, do you want to see everything bright and nice even though you're underexposing the frame? You can turn that on and off here. Connect to smart device, that's just, I use that to connect to my phone for firmware updates or to upload images. The power off delay, that's more important for me because I do these videos and there's times where I just don't want the camera timing out. Exposure compensation for flash, if I do happen to use this flash, I might want to dial up how much fill it's adding. Like I said, I start out at about minus 1.7 stops, but there's times where I want to dial that back a little bit. Flash control, do I want to just manually control how much flash is coming out, or do I want to do through the lens metering? And that's it. That is the complete menu walkthrough. I told you it was going to be long. I told you it was going to be comprehensive and move fast. You can always hit pause. You can always replay this. I do have, you know, links in this video's full description to each different section of the menu. You can also see across the bottom of the video the different sections. They're chaptered out so that you can move to the point you want to go to. Again, the second video that I do is going to be much, much shorter. We're just going to set up the U3 and the U2 mode to be able to snap into a setting just by flipping that switch to automatically be ready for wildlife, sports, or action, or to be set up in a mode to shoot landscapes and night scenes and that kind of thing, still lifes. All right, so I appreciate it. You know, there's a short review video along with image review and some recommendations for how to use this camera, what lenses and accessories to potentially buy for it. You can run over, you can see that was linked early on in this video. It's also in this video's full description if you click the title or show more, along with links to the camera and other things in my store and links to things on affiliate sites that help me out a little bit, and I appreciate it. Every little bit helps if you use those links from me. You can also run over to hudsonhenry.com/ATSlinks, and that link is right up above me. You can just click it. And the other thing I would say is that we do have the full settings, everything I've gone through, how I've customized my menus. If you want to download that, I have a lot of people who do that for different cameras, and those are always linked over on my website under free downloads, but you can also just hit the link up above my head to run over there, and you'll see the Z52 settings, and you can put those on your memory card and load settings, just how I showed you how to do. All right, everybody, thanks so much for watching. It's a killer little camera. I hope that you enjoy it to the hilt.